This is the Courage to Face Failure podcast, a limited series following the pivotal moment of reckoning as the Southern Baptist Convention faces the sexual abuse crisis within its churches. I'm Carolyn McCulley, host of this series, and a filmmaker also working on a related documentary. In this third episode, investigative reporter Robert Downen joins me with fellow journalists Kate Shellnutt of Christianity Today and Bob Smietana of Religion News Service. We're discussing the aftermath of the bombshell investigation by Guidepost Solutions of Southern Baptist leadership and the reaction at the SBC's annual meeting, which was held in mid-June in Anaheim, California. Shortly after we recorded this episode, the SBC announced that it was under investigation by the Justice Department for sexual abuse, saying multiple SBC entities are being investigated and that each will fully and completely cooperate. As we record this episode, it's been 6 weeks since we were all together in Anaheim for the Southern Baptist Convention's 2022 annual meeting, but it seems much longer than that given the pace of the news cycle this summer. And as journalists, you three must really feel that increased pace of breaking news. But let's cast our minds back to Anaheim. That was the first time I attended an SBC annual meeting in person, though I did live stream the whole 2021 meeting. And I remember spotting you there, Rob, sitting next to some of my friends. And you, Kate, recorded a remote interview with me for the documentary film I'm directing on the survivors who are holding the SBC to account for this abuse crisis. You literally reported from the floor of the convention, like sitting on the carpet in a convention center hallway, talking to your laptop. Good times. I really appreciated getting your commentary then, though. But I didn't get to meet you, Bob, in person until this year's event. So, for any new listeners to this series, let's set the stage for this year's meeting. Rob, we last spoke just a day after the Guidepost Solutions report was released on May 22nd, and you, Rachel Denhollander, and I were all still processing the details in that report. I expected it would attract a lot of media attention, but I was really surprised by the amount of international coverage, though I probably shouldn't have been, given the fact that the SBC is a global entity. So, Kate and Bob, I'll ask you the same thing I asked Rob in the previous episode. Was there anything in the Guidepost report that surprised you? Kate, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think that there were things that surprised me, but probably the same things that were the top level takeaways that for a lot of people who've been following the story. What didn't surprise me were some of the survivor stories, because a lot of those were ones we were already familiar with from following these people on Twitter, interviewing them ourselves. I wasn't aware of the big news around Johnny Hunt being accused of abuse and the account that was included there. That was one that I think was new and breaking news to all of us. And then the other was the existence of this list of accused abusive pastors, abusive Baptist pastors. And that was one that felt like a real punch for all of us, knowing how much the idea of a list had been something that survivors had called for all this time.
Yeah, and the same for me. Johnny Hunt was a big surprise. The irony of Johnny Hunt being accused in this report and Johnny Hunt being elected back in 2008, when they had first talked about having a database and it was shot down the same year that Johnny Hunt is elected. So there's kind of an irony there. I was surprised by, not surprised, but reminded by how many SBC presidents have been involved in either abusive behavior or mishandling abuse. So we had Johnny Hunt, Frank Page, who leaves office for having some kind of moral indiscretion, an affair with someone. And if it was when he was at a church he was at, that is now considered abusive behavior. Steve Gaines, mishandling and abuse. Jack Graham is in there for issues at his church. Ronnie Floyd is in there, Paige Patterson. But it's a lot of the SBC presidents of the last 20 years. And there's a narrative that the number of people listed in this report is very few among the 40,000 SBC churches. But it's interesting that many leaders at their congregations or in their lives had that firsthand experience with abuse, either being abusers or mishandling something.
And the fact that it is, right, people at the top, people who are influential. I mean, the one thing that came to mind with Johnny Hunt was I thought back to a video that I had watched when we were reporting on the Ravi Zacharias situation, where there's this strange video where they had an opening ceremony for one of the massage parlors where Ravi recruited and abused masseuses, women. And Johnny Hunt gave the invocation prayer for the opening of this massage parlor. It as an event was strange even before you knew what was happening. The web that you can tie in between the people who we now know to be abusive, it does make you suspicious of cover up, who knows what is this network?
Yeah. Frank Page being around in 2008 as well, saying we can't do anything about abuse. And then all the Sing Oldham stuff, I can't tell you how many times I've talked to Sing Oldham. And that Sing Oldham had a list is really ironic. Because back in 2008, the SBC had a directory of pastors, and you could find all these, pastors in there who were convicted sex offenders who were in there, and them saying, we have no idea, we can't track any of this, and kind of taking us to task. How dare you ask us to keep a list? And then they have a list. There's a lot of irony there.
Right. And for everybody who's listening to this who isn't as immersed in the topic as we are, Bob, can you tell us again who Sing Oldham is? Because that's not a name that gets flung around a lot.
Yeah, Roger Sing Oldham was the longtime, basically media spokesperson for the SBC from at least 2008, and was the person we called to get commentary, the person explaining the SBC, person, arranging interviews with the president, and the person sort of defending and explaining SBC polity and beliefs to us. So his role in this was to be the person to say, we have no control over churches. You don't understand our polity. You don't understand how we operate. And then behind the scenes, sort of coordinating that.
Yeah. My first foray with Sing was about 2 weeks before we published Abuse of Faith. Him and Augie Bodo, then the acting chair of the executive committee, or the head of the executive committee, and obviously a key player and who featured prominently in that report. They had about an hour and a half long sit down conversation with John Tedesco and I, where we just explained some of our findings. And one of the things that John actually pointed out this summer that I thought was very perceptive of him is that, they said repeatedly during that interview that they were, grieved and saddened and all of these things, but never once said that they were surprised by anything. And it was one of those things where, as a journalist, when that report came out in May, John and I talked and we were like, did we just never ask them if they had a list? And we were like, I guess we didn't, because in retrospect, it's easy to think we should have asked that. But the idea that they were doing this while pushing back with such ferocity that they were, it was kind of just unthinkable at the time. And I think really does speak to just the shock of finding out that they were doing it the entire time.
Yeah, I agree with you. And we're going to get to talking about actually that list and its release in a minute. But one of the oddities of that time that I remember after the report was released was that same day that the report was made public, former SBC President Paige Patterson, who also refused to cooperate with the investigation, spoke at a large church, First Baptist Church of Dallas, and there he said he was falsely accused. Now, let's discuss why it was significant that Patterson was speaking the Sunday the Guidepost report was released publicly. Kate, do you want to jump in on that one?
Sure. There's a few things. One, just it's an evidence that Paige Patterson, despite more allegations or more claims coming out detailing the ways that he has been involved in the overall abuse crisis, that he still has a place within the SBC, that there would have been a path or narrative, maybe one that you would assume, where this would be the time for someone like this to lay low, to retire, to stop having a prominent ministry. But that's not been the case with him. So the fact that he's spoken at a number of churches and conferences over the years, he continues to share the stage with people who are Southern Baptists, and he continues to attend the annual meeting, as we saw. So none of the things that have been revealed about him have really diminished his ministry, other than him not holding the position he used to hold at Southwestern. The fact that it was at First Baptist Dallas, that's the place where he and Augie Bodo, I think, met in a Bible study class. And that's the place where he was getting connected with Paul Pressler, who's another man who has been accused and was named in this report, as well as in previous reporting. So that's kind of the epicenter for both the conservative resurgence, but then also now we know for a long pattern of cover up or failure to respond by senior SBC leaders.
Yeah, I got to have a nice breakfast with Paige in Anaheim. I don't think he thought it was as nice because I just kind of sat down at his table at the Conservative Baptist Network. But I ended up, after almost 5 years of hounding him for any kind of interview, any kind of comment other than obfuscation through his longtime lawyer, finally got a few minutes to talk to him. And he effectively told me that Jesus had forgiven him for all of his sins. He kept referring to himself as the world's second worst sinner and saying that Jesus had forgiven him. When I asked him repeatedly to specify what those sins were, to clarify, he just kept saying, well, I don't want to talk about that, but I can tell you that I've been forgiven. So going back to the thing about the report, there were actually two things that involved him at First Baptist Dallas. There was the sermon or Bible study class where he was definitely trying to preempt some sort of bad PR by saying, oh, it's another liberal lie about me, which again, if you know anything about the history of the conservative resurgence, that was kind of their go-to. I mean, like Paul Pressler talks in the opening parts of his book about how all press are lying and everyone is out to get them. And it's just this perpetual victim complex that they have while also at the same time victimizing people themselves or not caring for victims themselves. So the idea that he was speaking at First Baptist Dallas, both in the week before and the week after that report came out, both with a mind towards his own public reputation rather than the contents of the report and the investigation with which he did not cooperate, I think speaks volumes about his character.
It's worth mentioning, he has an ongoing long-term senior Bible study there that he's taught forever. So his being fired from the seminary, his being accused of stealing from the seminary, all the abuse stuff, none of that has affected his relationship at First Baptist. He's been impervious. And you could kind of argue that the whole CBN founders ministry, new conservative resurgence, is an attempt to reestablish his legacy. That's the entire project here.
Yeah, and let's stop for a minute and talk about that, because CBN, the Conservative Baptist Network, is something that needs to be looked at in the history of the relationships with Paige Patterson. And so, Bob, can we talk about that a little bit more for listeners who aren't really tracking that story?
Sure. So this is a new network of people, like the Conservative Baptist Network of Southern Baptists. They kind of style themselves as a rebirth or a revitalization of the conservative resurgence of the 70s and 80s. So if folks don't know, in the 70s and 80s, a group of folks led in large part by Paige Patterson and Paul Pressler and others, but they were kind of the masterminds of it, basically took over the convention. And sometimes it's called the fundamentalist takeover, sometimes it's called the conservative resurgence. It's the defining moment of Southern Baptist life in the last few decades. It's the moment that everyone has to give homage to. These are the sainted figures. Even in the middle of the abuse, you have to talk about how great the conservative resurgence was, how it saved the Southern Baptist Convention. And there's a mythology that the SBC would have declined. And the mythology used to be that if we get rid of the liberals and moderate people, we're going to have growth and growth and growth. And now that's been changed to, well, if we hadn't got rid of them, things would be much worse. We have decline now, but it'd be much worse. So this group was rebuilt after Paige Patterson was fired. He was fired for mishandling a rape at a seminary he was at, and probably for lying or misleading the board of directors for the seminary. So this group is made up of folks who want to restore him to glory. But they are particularly aggressive in fighting any reform on sexual abuse. And they will, I think, be particularly aggressive in the future of fighting any reforms on this.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that the conservative resurgence, there's much more kind of agreement among Southern Baptists that happened at a time where liberal drift was a real possibility or threat, that people can kind of point to evidence of whether it was beliefs that pastors held, theological positions that they saw in seminaries, that, hey, there was a possibility of us going in this direction. There's a lot less consensus now about the idea of liberal drift. And in fact, a lot of mainstream Southern Baptists would say the accusations that the Conservative Baptist Network, their characterization of our denomination at this point is actually really inaccurate, that what they say is liberal drift is actually us continuing to hold theologically conservative positions and often politically conservative positions, just like we always have. So basically, you've created this sense of fear when really we're just as conservative. We still believe the same things that we've always believed about women, about God, that kind of thing. And they see it as a real distraction or just like a false description of what the denomination is. So I think that the big difference is that this is a minority view that is, according to the majority, mischaracterizing where the convention stands now.
I think that the tough thing about gauging and talk about the SBC in this way is that using terms like minority and majority, like, yes, the majority of voters at the annual meeting voted against CBN policies and candidates and voted for abuse reforms. But like that CBN breakfast felt much more of the culture of the everyday in the Pew Southern Baptist than I think the annual meeting did, because it was a political event. Charlie Kirk, the head of Turning Point USA, this college network that has grown increasingly far right over the years, and it has increasingly aligned itself with white nationalist and Christian nationalist groups and figures. This CBN group has really, I think, grasped onto the broader Republican Party political playbook, which is just to keep moving the boogeyman, keep inventing something that's an outside threat, keep everyone in a perpetual wartime mode, and therefore scared and therefore not willing to take the step backwards and say, oh, how have we collectively failed to, say, address a sexual abuse crisis or hold leaders accountable for their failures, whether financial, whether sexual abuse, whether moral or ethical, what have you. And they really have drawn from this playbook in a way that I do think is very concerning and would resonate much more with the everyday Southern Baptist than it would, say, the people who have the time, money, and wherewithal and interest to fly to Anaheim, California for a few days to vote on policies in a sweltering hot room.
Yeah, and talking about the Conservative Baptist Network is important because there were things that were leading up to the annual meeting in which we start to see, okay, here's how the playbook's going to go. Here's how the opposition's going to run. And one of them was the cost of the reforms. And so there were people who were immediately jumping onto the fact that during a June 2nd meeting, the executive committee, also called the EC, voted to provide up to $9 million for funding the task force recommendations. And they authorized up to $5 million from the EC operating reserves to pay for the legal fees. But immediately there were people who were jumping on this and saying, oh, but that's taking money away from the missionaries. You know, it's our reason for giving cooperatively, et cetera. And then on June 6th, Guidepost Solutions tweeted its support of Pride Month. And that one tweet threatened an entire year's worth of work. And so right there, you have two things that were already causing tension before we even got to the event.
Yeah, let's talk about some of these things. Just off of the top of my head, I could easily name, without even doing any independent research, 5 or 6 lawsuit settlements that would double or quadruple the cost for preventing sexual abuse that is apparently so egregious that some people think that they shouldn't be pursuing reforms. So if their concern is financial, then it's a silly argument because they're paying out much more in lawsuit settlements than they are in any kind of prevention. And if their rationale is entirely financial, then what they're saying is that the mission and evangelism is more important than stopping children from being abused. And that was such a common theme in our reporting. Well, we can't say anything because it will affect the broader mission. Well, guess what? 10, 15 years after they started saying that, I'm now hearing from pastors across the world who are saying the SBC abuse report has been everywhere, and our missionaries cannot function without us and making real concrete steps. Because the SBC, there's so much focus on what's happening with abuse domestically, but the pattern at the IMB and the pattern within missionary work more broadly has been often to just ignore it and recycle these guys because it's in a faraway place. And, you know, there's certainly an argument to be made about the othering of the people that are being evangelized. So they're giving these people often, or we're giving them often, just free reign to abuse whomever with no follow-up, no investigation, no oversight or anything, and all in the name of the mission. So when I hear people talk about, oh, the financial costs and the impact of the mission, all I hear is resuscitations of the exact same problems that led to the abuse crisis in the first place. And going to the Guidepost thing, again, another thing that I wish we had written more about and I wish got more attention in this whole abuse scandal and crisis. The SBC, and this is not a judgment on their views on homosexuality or anything. I'm just saying that the number of victims and survivors we talked to who said, I was so afraid of coming forward because I was abused by a man and I was a boy. And I thought that made me gay. I thought that meant that I was inviting it, and it irreparably damaged my sexuality, irreparably damaged my ability to contextualize my sexuality within my abuse and within my relationship with God. The often just outright homophobia in some wings of the SBC has absolutely contributed to this problem in ways that they don't want to talk about because it requires talking about how they talk about something that they find detestable. And so, again, the three things that you just mentioned are all pillars of this abuse crisis. And the fact that there are still people holding on to those pillars as reasons not to address the abuse crisis is frankly only going to perpetuate another abuse crisis.
I remember, if we're talking about like the tensions leading up between the release of the report and the meeting, that these being two factors, I remember the first time that I read the report, one of the thoughts I had is, this is well evidenced, it's very thorough. I had to start thinking, okay, what are people going to start to do to discredit it? Like, that's where my mind had to go, because as I've reported on Southern Baptists, that there's never been a case of unanimity among Southern Baptists. So it wasn't going to be the thing that this report is released and we have all this evidence and now everybody's on board and it's thumbs up and let's do it. It would be, yeah, but. And the yeah, but was, yeah, but we can't afford it. Or, yeah, but we can't have these people do it. Or, and I was waiting for this of when would people discredit guideposts? And it was, yeah, but we can't trust a secular organization that has such and such a stance. And so it really was the shoe that I was waiting to drop and kind of what I expected. I thought that there was a chance that the report might go easy and not be as detailed. But once it was that detailed, I thought, okay, well, what's the next wrinkle going to be?
I would say the way the SBC is set up is not particularly good for getting to get along. It's called a cooperative program. They do cooperate. So the timing of this report didn't work well with the way they operate. The year before, they set a formula, who gets what percentage of all this money comes in. And then they set a budget. The report comes in after the budget is set. So they have to get everyone now to agree. And getting a whole bunch of Baptists to agree on anything is difficult. There's also a side note. There is a kind of simmering feud over control of the money. The executive committee wanted to have a lot more control over how money is spent, and the agencies that the money goes to were very reluctant to give that. So there's been a simmering back office argument over how money is spent in finances for a while. So it comes in the middle of that. So the funding of this was affected also by that. Like, they're already feuding about money. And so to come in and say, we need this money from the executive committee funds, you had a bunch of people who were not going to agree on that because they disagree about how money should be spent, not necessarily on abuse. I mean, I think they're really well aware how fragile the whole thing is. This is a $1 billion enterprise, which is held together with a shoestring, right? They have a few volunteer trustees, and they have an executive committee that meets once in a while, and they oversee this enormous international organization. And those trustees, each of those agencies has trustees who organize their work. But there's not a lot of oversight of what's going on. There's a lot of trust to say that we think the staff's doing the right thing. Those trustees don't have a lot of power to tell the agency heads what to do. And some of the agency heads see themselves as kind of kings of their operations. So I think they all know that if they really want to operate this in a appropriately professional enterprise, they need to have a lot more oversight. And they're so opposed to oversight of the local church, and it's all cooperative. That does threaten them. It threatens the way they have operated for a long time and exposes the weaknesses of this. And the IMB, nobody wants to talk about problems with the IMB because this is why they go together. It's all great. And Rob is right. There are stories for decades now of sexual misconduct by missionaries being covered up. No one wants to know that story.
Right. But where I was going with the tweet from Guidepost was the pushback to the authority of Guidepost to actually run this investigation and to make recommendations, because immediately it became, this godless organization can't tell us what to do. While other people on the internet were like, well, hello, they were reporting on the problems in our midst. So maybe that's what we should be focusing on.
It fits what the CBN wants to say, is that we have a Bible, we just follow the Bible, everything would go away, and there's no problem. And these godless atheists told us the thing. It was a perfect playbook for the group that wants to say there's liberal drift. and wants to say, why are we involved with these other folks? And Guidepost is telling a lie, and it's not that bad. It fits the narrative really well.
So as we go through this timeline, we're now arriving at the annual meeting itself. There's a lot that happened over those few days, but let's start with how different this year's meeting was for the survivors themselves, as compared to what happened in previous years.
I can say that I remember back in 2019 was a time where I met Krista Brown, who is a survivor who is named in the report and whose story is featured really prominently, and also who's well known online for sharing her story there. And she and Jules Woodson and a number of the other SBC abuse survivors were protesting outside of the convention center, protesting, demonstrating, holding signs, wearing matching t-shirts, doing a press conference. And I remember hearing chatter inside of messengers of pastors telling each other, don't talk to them, don't engage with them. And there were people who did want to come and speak with them, but it really was almost like that crossing the picket line moment. Like you were really making a statement if you were a pastor who was willing to say, hey, I'm so sorry, tell me what happened to you, like to engage with them in any way. Whereas the majority were kind of like, don't make eye contact, let's walk past, because you had to pass where they were set up to go from like your hotel to the meeting every morning. So literally they were not in the convention hall. They were outside. You could kind of just see in their positionality, like how different that was. Then of course, last year, we did see some survivors come inside, be a part of the meeting as guests, but their position was really precarious, where I think a lot of them felt unsafe. A lot of them were crying. And even though this was a time where we did see the proposal for the report to go forward, we did see efforts to like speak from the microphones to talk about the abuse crisis and to stand with survivors. I think a lot of them were really scared, the ones who chose to come, and felt really at risk, where they knew that there were people in the room who didn't want them there and who disbelieved them, who saw them as the enemy. This year, that might have still been the case, where we do see a divide in how survivors are approached. But at least from the stage, there was like a recognition repeatedly of welcome messengers and survivors, that it was very much like, we're going to make reference to them as many times as we can. And at least for the ones who felt comfortable enough to come, I think each of them in the end felt like that extension, that invitation, that welcome was genuine for the first time, which again is a very bare minimum and something that should have always been the case.
You know, for the longest time, in the wake of our stories, one of the common lines that SBC leaders have used is that, you know, because you can't quantify the extent of the abuse problem in the SBC, the solutions and reforms that are passed are going to be very hard to quantify as well. And so rather than doing that, what the SBC needed to do, they would say, is undergo this broader culture change. And, you know, that's something that's very hard to write about as a journalist. It's not like something that there's easy benchmarks, but getting out of that meeting, I mean, there were so many different little things that, like, taken together as kind of like pointillism, added up to like a picture that was far different than the one even a few years ago. I'm thinking of the first interaction I had really when I got there was with Tiffany Thigpen and Jules Woodson, just walking up to Paige Patterson and confronting him outside the convention hall. And then as they were doing that, the Den Hollanders happened to walk up, and like all of a sudden you had Tiffany, who had for 30 plus years been dealing with the consequences of Paige covering for the man who later attacked her. You had all of a sudden this small little army of people just standing in support with her as she looked down the guy who irrevocably changed her life. I think of a few minutes later running into Debbie Vasquez, who we opened up our story with and who was one of the key drivers of the 2008 reform push. And then in 2019 at the Caringwell conference, she spent 3 days driving a motorized scooter through throngs of people a few days before she was going to go into surgery that she thought she might die from. She spent those last few days trying to get attention about her abuser, who is still in ministry. And not only was she back at the meeting, she had a booth, and Bart Barber, who would go on to be president, spent 15 minutes talking with her at that booth. The next day, they elected Barber as the president and passed all these abuse reforms. Bart being one of the trustees at Southwestern, who was behind the death knell and the Patterson thing, because he was willing to speak out in Dallas in 2018 about Patterson, what was going on behind the scenes. They elected him instead of the candidate that the Patterson ilk was backing in Tom Askell. And then that night, there was a not officially SBC sanctioned event, but there was a panel on trauma-informed responses that featured Rachel Denhollander and David Pittman, a survivor who we've written extensively about. And the first people I saw when I walked into that room was Philip Bethencourt, who was former second in command at the ERLC and was pretty proactive on abuse reforms along with Russ Moore. And then JD Greer and Todd Unzicker were also there, Todd being his kind of assistants during JD's presidency. And JD ended up closing the meeting in prayer and having just a very open dialogue, brief but open dialogue with Debbie Vasquez as she sat in her motorized wheelchair from the floor. And those are the type of things where I look back, I'm like, oh, like as culture change goes, you can't measure those things, but there was definitely a real different feel to this meeting. I'll say that.
Yeah, in 2008, which was the first SBC meeting I covered, survivors were not there. There was a general, we think abuse is terrible, we can't do anything about it. And there was a willingness on the floor to say, okay, we trust our leaders to tell us what our policy says and what we can and can't do. And that's been a big change. There's less trust of leaders. There's less willingness to go along and say, there's nothing we can do. There's definitely a rejection of that. Now, the survivors were there. People were willing to vote for reforms, and people were not willing to deal with nonsense.
Well, one of the things that struck me was the fact that there was a room set aside for the survivors to go, an escape room, if you will. And not only was that a special place for them to go, they had blankets and couches. They had all sorts of things for physical comfort, recognizing that physical comfort is important when you're trying to process trauma. And then they brought in 3 trauma-informed therapists to be able to talk to them and help the survivors process what was going on. This kind of honoring really floored the survivors who made it. And not all survivors came. Some made plans to come, like Krista Brown, and then at the last minute said, I can't. In some ways, I wish Krista had gone just to have experienced that difference. But then on the other hand, I have not walked in her shoes for all these years, so I have to honor her decision. But it was striking to me, for somebody who was there in person for the first time, how different it was based on all the things that I've researched and all the footage I've come up with for this documentary. So let's talk then about, in a year where they're going to vote on these reforms and they're going to fund these reforms, at the same time, the Conservative Baptist Network is having its own events, and they bring in John MacArthur. Did that send a message?
MacArthur is sort of the hero of the CBN world. And there have been lots of questions about how he has handled sexual abuse in his church. I haven't reported much about that, but there are lots of questions about it.
Go ahead.
I guess I can say along the same lines as what Bob's saying. And it's almost confusing when I try to explain it to people who aren't Southern Baptists that really the only thing that's supposed to bring Southern Baptists together is, hey, we agree on this basic theological stances, and we also want to be Southern Baptists and encourage our Southern Baptist entities and measures. And on the other hand, you have CBN, who is platforming people who aren't Southern Baptist, like John MacArthur and like Charlie Kirk, bringing in people who agree not on the theological things that the SBC shares and who are not promoting the SBC entities. So it really does feel so separate, like such a different realm than what the only thing that's supposed to bring Southern Baptists together, which is this kind of Southern Baptist shared theology and heritage. So it makes it real clear that they have other aims and priorities for what they want to platform. And John MacArthur has a lot of things that he's known for now. It's in the wake of COVID, he's really pushing the don't let the government shut us down, freedom to worship, people are against us. And then, he also has a perspective on abuse and on how you counsel and work through abuse in marriage that I think might be more aligned with the folks on the CBN side than the people who are leading the way in terms of the caring well and trauma-informed ministry on the other side. So it's more just emphasizing the contrast between these two wings of who's claiming Southern Baptist identity right now.
And he also is very anti-women preaching or speaking in churches, and that's another rallying point where he agrees with them.
Now, let's talk about Tuesday, June 14th, because that was the day the task force, the sexual abuse task force, made their recommendations to the convention and put forward the things that they wanted to reform. I was busy with my film crew running around, trying to get a shot. You're paying attention, but you're also focused on what you're doing, where you're shooting, what's the reaction, etc. So you're not getting the whole read of the room the same way as if you're sitting there. And I'd love to hear from you all. Kate, I'm going to put you on the spot here. Tell us about how it felt in that room. Were you able to watch the reaction of the survivors? What was going on in the platform? Because as we were filming, I had this sense that this was a big moment.
Yeah, I think going into the annual meeting, I expected it to have a level of gravity to it from the start. And I was kind of surprised that it felt for the first few presentations like really business as usual. It is a business meeting. They have to have all these different people speak and present. They had worship that felt normal. To me, it wasn't until that task force presentation that things really got as serious as I think to match like the level of the findings of the report, and where it really did feel heavy. And I would attribute that to Bruce Frank, who was the chair of the task force. He's an Asheville pastor, and he has kind of a football coach CrossFit vibe to him. He's very like serious guy, like comes in there, no nonsense. He spoke really forcefully, I thought, about the findings in the report and was really serious about this is our time to repent. And I felt like he was really serious and loud and didn't try to tiptoe around the findings of the report, really stood by the takeaway that this is our moment to repent and to make things right. And he was the one who said this is the bare minimum, and was also not triumphant about what the offerings were going to be in these proposals. He really saw it as the baseline for what could be done. And so I was impressed by that. And I think for a lot of people that's the moment that they had been waiting to hear. And maybe it was a little bit of a slap in the face to people who had wanted to minimize these findings or who had wanted to move on too quickly. That's what I thought from Bruce.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Bruce commanded the room. There were people who wanted to change things. I think a real telling moment was Mark Coppinger, who's a former SBC seminary president, got up, said there's not that many. This is like the 1619 report. Then he sort of said, why should my church care and pay money for something someone else did? And
I couldn't believe he used the words. I still think of it.
Yes.
It's kind of cheesy.
It's kind of cheesy. Like, why
is how he characterized
Jesus,
the response.
yeah.
It's kind of cheesy that we would do this.
What kind of cheese is he eating is the real question.
And there was also this thing is, even if it was real, I shouldn't care because I didn't give money for this. A little bit like Cain and Abel. Am I my brother's keeper? And the whole room, two things happened. One, there was an uproar. And then the chair was like, no. We don't chow people down. What I think is interesting about the SBC, like big picture, is this is one of the first times where large numbers of people in the pew or pastors of normal sized churches have had a vote. So if you look at the Catholic abuse scandal, it's bishops. There's some lay people vote by leaving, but people didn't have a say. These big mega churches, there's abuse scandals, the people don't have a say. This is one of the first times where people have been asked, what do you want to do? What do you want to know about abuse? And overwhelmingly, they're like, we want to do whatever we can, and we want to know everything we can. And anyone who said we don't want to, we don't have time for you. It's really pretty remarkable. Now, do they have sustainability? I don't know. But it's pretty remarkable. They said, yes, we want to know what went wrong. And if there's ways to fix it, we want to fix it. And anyone who wants to say that wasn't true or we aren't going to care about it, we are not going to listen to you. Shut up with your nonsense. We're pretty serious. There was a slap down from the crowd of like, this is not the time or place for your petty or your personal grievances. This is the time to say, we know we have a problem and we can cooperate to do something.
One other thing I will note from that time on the floor, I spent most of that vote just walking in circles around the microphones, writing down who was standing at mics. And at almost every single microphone was a member or a person who's supportive of the Conservative Baptist Network and someone who was fairly prominent. So It's been interesting to watch the CBN kind of play it both ways, where they're commending the progress made for abuse reforms while disagreeing with some of the merits. And yet they were flooding the zone at every single microphone. And not just speak in opposition, but speak in opposition via points that were entirely separate from what the actual discussion was.
Yeah, actually, I ran into a woman that I know on the floor that day. And she would have been somebody who historically supported the conservative resurgence because of theological fidelity. She was one of those who was there early on in that movement, was supporting the theological movement toward biblical inerrancy. And yet, at this event, she's running around with her yellow ballot in her back pocket. She doesn't want to let go of it for a moment because she was ready to forcefully vote for the reforms. And I think that's a good illustration of what we're seeing with people who in the first movement may not have been aware of all the other things that were happening within the leadership, who are now seeing it and saying, no, we want these abuse reforms to take place. We want theological fidelity, and we do expect behavior to be modeled that is Christ-like.
I think that we would be doing a discredit by talking about the CBN as if they are the conservative resurgence 2.0. They're not. They're a splinter group that's fashioned themselves as grassroots. And while they have much of the same makeup, playbook, and players of the conservative resurgence had real grievances and there were real disagreements. Whereas the CBN's quest to do whatever it is they're trying to do, the windmills they're fighting are political. I'll say that. And so I just want to be careful to make sure that we're not making a direct equation between those two movements, because I do think that that is what the CBN wants, despite it not being the actual case.
So there's this other thing that was swirling around in the convention. And before the film crew and I even arrived in Anaheim, I heard rumors about a forthcoming article that was going to try to undermine the veracity of the Guidepost report.
I did hear from survivors before the meeting. I think that their fear was knowing this kind of coverage was coming, that they thought this will be it. This is what undoes all these efforts. And I think it's just part of a survivor mentality that for so long there's always been somebody to discredit them, that it's really hard to hold out hope that maybe the proposals would go through, that there almost always had to be what's going to stop it this time. And I think their fear was that, hey, this is going to come out and that's what's going to be what stopped it. I didn't hear much chatter in Anaheim about this at all. Everything powered through as planned. However, at least one fear presented is, hey, pastor, you're going to be accused falsely. You're going to be set up. Someone is going to entrap you, which is like these worst stereotypes, right, of women in the church, is that they're out to get their pastors in like sexually compromising positions. So it builds into that idea of, hey, if we call into question a prominent case, then maybe we get in pastors' minds that any pastor can be up. And what's more unjust than to believe something without the right number of witnesses per the Bible, than to not have due process. And so it gets wrapped up in all these other ideals.
To piggyback on what you said, it does send a message that if you come forward, this is what awaits you. No one is going to listen. No one is really going to look into it. We're going to figure out how we can say this is not abuse, how we can say this is not a problem. There's no reward for you to coming forward.
But I think that's true, though. If we look at the pattern of experiences, what survivor hasn't faced that level of disbelief and then accusation?
The other talking point for the CBN group is to say that adults cannot be abused. There's a coordinated agenda to say adults can't be abused. Adult women who say they're abused are the enemy. They're adulterers, and they're going to get away with something. They're getting away with something. And this is going to take a long time to change because there's so much resistance and so much unwillingness to say, how much is it going to cost me to make this change? And it's easier to just say, well, we did our thing and now we paid our money and we just make this go away. We think abuse is terrible. They really shouldn't do this way, but we can't do anything.
If Baptists drank publicly, a great drinking game at the meeting would just be to take a shot every single time someone says something to the effect of Baptists love a good fight. And it's kind of what Bob is saying. It's this like folksy one-liner that they use to kind of like reinforce, like, oh, you know, like everyone, all opinions are welcome here. And you know, but at the end of the day, we're brothers in Christ and we hug it out and it's all about the mission.
I will say one thing, at least they do it in public. This isn't like the Catholic bishops or whoever else, some of these other meetings where we don't really want you there.
At least they're not as political and secretive as the Catholics.
So
It's not the greatest benchmark.
I mean, it sounds terrible. Other denominations are not as open. Episcopalian, all these other folks, they're not as open to having this out with the press and being open about it. So they are at least one thing on their side is they're open to the media in a way that other folks aren't.
They're evangelical. They always think it's a chance to witness. They want as much attention as they could get because of their mission. And you wouldn't believe the things that people will say after saying something like, well, of course I oppose abuse. And then you can say anything after that. Once that's of course I oppose abuse, but not this person or not this case, or we can't put a rule here. And it's as if the more they reiterate that, the more it's just going to go away if they keep saying they oppose it, when really we know that's not the case.
Yes, and as many people have already said, what happened in Anaheim was the bare minimum. Thanks to each of you for joining me here today. And Bob, congratulations to you on the launch of your new book, Reorganize Religion, The Reshaping of the American Church and Why It Matters. So much work lies ahead for Southern Baptists, and at the time of this recording, the details of the Justice Department's investigation are unknown. Only days before the SBC announced the investigation, SBC President Bart Barber named the members of the new Abuse Reform Implementation Task Force. This group is only authorized for 1 year, and it will be renewed, quote-unquote, as needed each year. It's hard to imagine how major reform in a large denomination could happen in only 1 year. But one thing is fairly certain, there will be opposition in 2023. This podcast has been a production of Citygate Films. It was produced and edited by me, Carolyn McCulley. One thing to consider before you go, if you'd like to support my documentary film and amplify the stories of the survivors and advocates, you can make a tax-deductible donation to the film's fiscal sponsor, the Southern Documentary Fund. Go to southerndocumentaryfund.org and search for Out of Darkness in the project list. There you can watch the film's story introduction and make a donation to receive a thank you credit in the film. Your support will help us finish this film faster. Thanks for listening.